The story began in the waning years of the 1820s, when Colonel Nathaniel Ashford ruled over his sprawling estate in Virginia with an authority that seemed unshakable. He was a decorated veteran of past wars, a man whose name carried weight in both political and social circles. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, his wealth drawn from the sweat and suffering of those he enslaved. To his peers, Ashford embodied the power and privilege of the Southern elite. Yet beneath the facade of strength lay cracks in the foundation of his dynasty, cracks that would widen until they swallowed his family whole. His wife, Eleanor, was a figure of quiet dignity, admired for her beauty and refinement. To outsiders, theirs was a union of strength and grace, the perfect image of Southern aristocracy. But behind closed doors, whispers lingered. The colonel was a man of appetites, some dark, some strange, and some that unsettled even those closest to him. Eleanor, often left alone in the great house while her husband pursued politics or pleasure, carried her loneliness like a wound. She moved through corridors filled with portraits of ancestors, haunted by the silence that pressed down upon her. The enslaved community on the Ashford plantation bore witness to both the colonel's cruelty and his wife's sorrow. Among them were 7 men who worked the hardest fields, strong in body and spirit, bound together by shared suffering. They were often spoken of as a group, 7 shadows who moved in rhythm, their lives entangled not only by their labor, but by the quiet defiance that flickered in their eyes. To the colonel, they were tools. To one another, they were brothers. It was within this charged world that the seeds of destruction were planted. The colonel, in a moment of reckless bravado and twisted pride, entered into an agreement that no one could have foreseen. Whether born of arrogance, desperation, or some darker desire, the pact would forever alter the course of his family's legacy, for Eleanor was not only his wife, but the key to the scandal that would one day echo through whispers of American history. And the 7 men, chained by law but unbroken in spirit, would become unwilling participants in an arrangement that blurred the line between power and ruin. The nights grew heavier with secrets. The estate, with its candlelit halls and silent fields, seemed to breathe with anticipation. A storm was gathering, not of weather but of consequence, and those who walked within Ashford's shadow would soon find themselves caught in its fury. The dynasty, gilded in wealth yet hollow at its core, was destined for collapse. And at the heart of it all stood Eleanor, the colonel, and the 7 men whose lives were bound by chains of both iron and fate. The pact was spoken of first in hushed tones, a strange suggestion that seemed too obscene to take root. Yet when Colonel Ashford raised his glass at a gathering of political allies and boasted of the power he held not only over land and wealth, but over the very flesh of those beneath him, the words spilled from his lips like venom. He claimed he could command anything, that his authority was absolute, that even his own wife would obey should he decree it. The men at the table laughed uneasily, unsure whether the colonel was drunk on whiskey or on his own pride. But Eleanor, standing silent in the corner, felt the sting of humiliation. She lowered her gaze, though her face burned, for she knew her husband's pride was dangerous. It was a pride that would rather burn down a house than admit a crack in its foundation. That night, when the guests had gone and the fire in the parlor burned low, Ashford confronted Eleanor with his twisted idea. He spoke of it not as suggestion but as command, that she would yield herself to 7 men from the fields, chosen by his hand, not out of love or mercy, but as proof of his dominance. Eleanor recoiled, her body trembling at the audacity of it, but he pressed forward, his voice sharp with cruelty. It was not desire that drove him, it was possession. The desire to prove even his wife was no more than an extension of his will. Eleanor wept, begging him to reconsider, but her pleas only fed his anger. To disobey would mean punishment far greater than shame. The 7 men, when told of the arrangement, reacted with shock and suspicion. They had endured whippings, starvation, back-breaking labor, yet nothing had prepared them for this command. They knew it was not a choice, for choice was a luxury stripped from them long ago. Still, among them, silent glances passed anger, guilt, confusion. Some feared a trap, believing the colonel might use this as pretense to accuse them of assault and execute them as examples. Others simply could not fathom being forced into such intimacy with the woman who walked the halls above them, untouchable and distant, Yet refusal was not an option. Refusal meant death. Elinor, in the days that followed, moved like a ghost through the halls of the manor. The portraits of Ashford ancestors seemed to sneer down at her, their painted eyes filled with judgment. She prayed in the chapel, her hands trembling as she whispered words she feared God himself could not forgive. In the silence of night, she thought of escape, of running until her feet bled. But where could she go? She was bound not only by her husband's command, but by the eyes of a society that would sooner condemn her than understand her plight. The appointed night arrived heavy with storm clouds, the air thick with humidity. The colonel orchestrated every detail, his cruelty evident in the precision. He chose the old barn at the edge of the estate, a place where no light from the manor windows could reach. Elinor, dressed in pale linen, was escorted there, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might give her away. The 7 men were already waiting, their faces shadowed, their chains loosened but not removed, a reminder of the control that still bound them. What followed was not passion but ritual, a spectacle of humiliation designed to feed Ashford's pride. He stood at a distance, his eyes cold, his lips curled into something between satisfaction and hatred. Elinor, trembling, forced herself into stillness. The men, equally trapped, moved with hesitation, their every motion heavy with the knowledge that they were puppets in a performance none had chosen. It was an act of survival, nothing more, but it left scars that would linger in every soul present. When it was over, Elinor collapsed onto the straw, her body racked with sobs. The men stood in silence, ashamed though no fault was theirs. The colonel dismissed them with a wave, as though they were cattle returning to the field, and turned his gaze upon his wife. He told her she was now bound to him in a way no woman had ever been bound to her husband, that no other man could command such loyalty, such power. Elinor did not answer, she could not. Her spirit had been crushed beneath the weight of degradation, but within that night's cruelty, something unexpected took root. The 7 men, once merely fellow sufferers, now carried a bond forged in shame and silence. They had shared in an act that blurred the line between subjugation and defiance, and Elinor, though broken, carried within her the seed of both despair and possibility. For whispers would begin soon enough, whispers of what the colonel had done, whispers that could not be silenced, no matter how tightly he gripped his empire. The Ashford dynasty, built upon pride and cruelty, had taken its first fatal wound. It bled quietly in the dark, unseen by the world, but the wound would fester, and in the shadows of that Virginia estate, the echoes of the pact spread like a curse, binding all who had been present to a future none could yet imagine. Weeks passed after that night, yet the weight of it lingered in every corner of the Ashford estate. Elinor could not step into the gardens without feeling the invisible gaze of judgment pressing against her back. Her maids, though silent, carried in their eyes a knowledge she could not escape. The 7 men returned to their work in the fields, their chains clinking with every step, but among them grew a strange, unspoken bond, one that neither the overseers nor even the colonel could fully extinguish. What had been meant as an act of humiliation had, in some dark irony, given them a new kind of unity. The colonel himself seemed invigorated in the aftermath. He boasted in private circles, careful to disguise the truth in shadows, but arrogant enough to let hints slip. He would speak of how a man must command every corner of his household, how true authority was proven in the breaking of boundaries others would never dare cross. His peers laughed uneasily, dismissing his words as the drunken arrogance of a powerful man, but whispers spread all the same. Those who dined at his table began to notice the hollow look in Elinor's eyes, the silence that clung to her like a shroud. Elinor retreated further into herself. Nights were sleepless. She wandered the halls, candle in hand, like a spirit haunting her own home. She avoided the colonel when she could, endured him when she could not, and clutched rosary beads until her fingers ached. Shame gnawed at her soul, but deeper than shame was fear, the fear of what the pact might yet yield. She felt it in her body, subtle at first, then undeniable, the possibility that new life might stir within her, and if it did, the question of paternity would hang like a blade over the dynasty. The 7 men carried their silence with dignity, but each in his own way wrestled with what had been done. Some felt guilt, as though they had betrayed an unspoken vow of resistance. Others carried rage, and still others confusion. They had been forced to share in a secret that could never be spoken aloud, a secret that bound them to one another and to Elinor in a way none of them had asked for. In the fields, their overseers mistook their quiet unity for weariness, but among the quarters, they began to inspire a new kind of talk. They were no longer simply men in chains. They were participants in the colonel's madness, unwilling yet transformed. One night, as thunder rolled across the hills, Elinor slipped out of the manor and walked to the barn where it had all begun. The smell of hay and earth brought back memories so vivid she nearly collapsed. But it was not memory alone that drew her there. It was defiance, quiet and trembling though it was, for in that place of humiliation she whispered prayers not of shame but of strength. She begged not only for forgiveness, but for the courage to survive the future that loomed ahead. Meanwhile, rumors began to creep beyond the estate. A stable boy who had stumbled too close to the barn that fateful night whispered tales to his mother, who carried them into the village. The story grew with every telling, how the colonel had offered his wife to his slaves, how madness had overtaken the Ashford house. By the time it reached the taverns, the whispers had become legend, half believed yet impossible to ignore. The Ashford name, once spoken with reverence, began to carry a shadow. Elinor's worst fear came true as her body confirmed what her heart had already suspected. She was with child. The knowledge broke her like glass. Each day she lived in dread, wondering whether the child would carry features that betrayed the pact. She told no one at first, not even her husband, but the Countess. Like air of secrecy soon became impossible to hide. Ashford, when he discovered the truth, was overcome with a wild, contradictory pride. He claimed the child as his own before the world, yet in the privacy of his chambers he looked into Elinor's eyes with a ferocity that chilled her blood. He needed the world to believe, but inside he knew doubt, and that doubt festered like poison. The 7 men heard whispers of the pregnancy through the grapevine of the quarters. They said nothing aloud, but each felt the weight of it settle on their shoulders. If the child bore resemblance to any of them, it would mean disaster, for Elinor, for themselves, for everyone bound to this cruel pact. And yet, hidden beneath their fear was a flicker of something else, the possibility that even within degradation, life had emerged, fragile yet undeniable. The Ashford household braced itself for the months to come. Elinor moved through each day with her head bowed, her hands folded over her swelling stomach, carrying not only the child but the weight of scandal, shame, and secrets. The colonel spoke louder, laughed harder, drank deeper, determined to drown the whispers around him. But the truth could not be silenced forever. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards of the estate, waiting for the moment it would rise to the surface and tear the dynasty apart. The months dragged on in a haze of dread, each sunrise marking another day closer to revelation. Elinor, pale and silent, carried her child beneath the watchful eyes of the estate. The maids whispered when she passed, their hands covering their mouths, while overseers muttered that something unnatural was brewing in the great house. The colonel in public strode with a swagger, proud of his wife's pregnancy as though it were proof of his virility, but in private his temper grew more volatile. He would stare at Elinor's belly with a mixture of pride and suspicion, as though he were daring the unborn child to betray him. In the quarters, the 7 men who had been forced into the pact lived in uneasy silence. Their bond grew stronger, but so too did their fear. None of them had asked for this fate, yet each knew they were tied now not only to one another, but to Elinor and the child she carried. When they worked the fields, they felt the overseer's eyes heavier upon them, as though even suspicion of guilt had become another chain. Nights in the quarters were filled with whispers. What if the child bore resemblance? What if it looked upon the world and carried the features of bondage instead of aristocracy? No amount of silence could erase such evidence. Elinor herself was torn between love and terror. Against her will, she began to feel the stirrings of maternal attachment. When the child quickened in her womb, she pressed her hands against her belly and whispered soft prayers. She did not know whether she prayed for the child's survival or for its absence, only that her heart split anew each time. In secret, she wondered whether God had abandoned her or whether this was his punishment, the embodiment of shame turned flesh. Yet there were moments in the stillness of night when she thought perhaps the child might be her salvation, the one thing that gave her a reason to endure. The colonel's arrogance, meanwhile, grew into madness. He began speaking more openly to his confidants, his voice sharp with a daring tone that unsettled them. He boasted of control so absolute that no scandal could touch him. Some of his allies nodded out of fear, but others recoiled. To them, his words smelled of corruption, of a man intoxicated with power and blind to consequence. His house, once a seat of respect, now drew shadows wherever it was mentioned. When the time of birth drew near, Elinor was confined to her chambers. The midwife, trembling beneath the colonel's threats, was sworn to secrecy. The night was storm-swept, rain slamming against the windows as Elinor labored. Her screams echoed through the halls, muffled behind closed doors, but no storm could mask the moment when a cry broke through the night, the cry of new life. The child was placed in Elinor's arms, slick with blood and trembling with breath, and at once her fears were confirmed and confounded. The infant's skin bore a shade that could not be explained away. Its features carried whispers of lineage no amount of denial could erase. Elinor wept as she held the child close, torn between overwhelming love and crushing dread. The midwife, pale as ash, tried to conceal her horror, but the colonel's eyes were sharp. He looked upon the child, and though his lips curled into a smile of forced pride, his hands trembled at his sides. He dismissed the midwife with threats and warnings, but the truth had already taken root. The next days were a study in contradiction. The colonel presented the child to the household as his heir, his voice booming with authority. Yet behind closed doors he raged. He accused Elinor of betrayal, though she could only look at him with hollow eyes. He considered punishing the 7 men, making an example of them, but he hesitated. To do so would be to admit the truth he was so desperate to hide. Instead, he turned his anger inward, pacing the halls at night like a beast trapped in a cage. The 7 men learned of the child's birth through whispers that spread like wildfire. Some felt pride in secret, others despair, all of them dread. They knew that the presence of this child changed everything. It was no longer only Elinor who carried the burden of the pact. It was now flesh and blood, living proof of the colonel's madness. Their bond, already heavy, deepened further. In hushed tones, they swore to protect one another, for they knew punishment could come at any moment. Elinor's love for her child grew even as fear shadowed every step. She rocked the infant in her arms, sang lullabies through tears, and prayed that somehow the world might be merciful. Yet she knew mercy was rare in the halls of power. The portraits of Ashford ancestors stared down from the walls, grim reminders that dynasties did not bend, they broke. And so the Ashford house stood on the edge of collapse. The child, innocent yet cursed by circumstance, had become both a beacon of love and the spark of ruin. The colonel, desperate to preserve his legacy, clung to lies that threatened to consume him. Elinor, trapped between love for her child and terror for its future, walked each day as though she bore not only her child, but the weight of judgment from the world itself. And the 7 men, bound by chains and silence, waited in dread for the moment when the truth would ignite the firestorm they all knew was coming. The child's presence in the Ashford manor transformed the atmosphere of the estate into something taut and brittle, as if every wall and windowpane strained under the weight of an unbearable secret. Elinor clung to her son with desperate tenderness, refusing to allow him out of her sight for long. She fed him, rocked him through sleepless nights, and shielded him from the venom in his father's eyes. For while the colonel proclaimed the infant as his heir before guests and neighbors, his private rage grew monstrous. Each time he looked upon the boy, he saw what others might one day see, skin and features that betrayed the lie he had tried to bury. His legacy, his dynasty, now balanced on the fragile edge of denial. The household servants, bound by both fear and gossip, could not ignore what their eyes revealed. They spoke in whispers as they worked, careful to keep their voices low but unable to silence their curiosity. In the quarters, the truth spread quickly, traveling from ear to ear, until the entire enslaved community knew the child bore the mark of the 7. Some regarded it as justice, others as tragedy, but all understood its danger. If word reached beyond the estate, the Ashford name would rot in scandal. The colonel's paranoia deepened with every passing week. He scrutinized Elinor with suspicion, berating her in private, demanding she maintain composure in public. He drank more heavily, slamming cups of whiskey down with trembling hands. At night he stalked the halls, his boots echoing like a drumbeat of dread. Sometimes he would slip into the nursery, staring at the child for long minutes in silence, as if wrestling with whether to cradle or to kill. Elinor would wake from uneasy sleep to find him looming there, his expression unreadable, his fingers twitching at his sides. Elinor herself lived in constant dread. She loved her son fiercely, yet every time she gazed upon him, her heart ached with fear. She prayed daily for God to protect him, to conceal the truth in the eyes of those who might judge. She carried him into the gardens where sunlight bathed his face, and in those moments she whispered promises, that she would fight for him, that she would not let the world take him, no matter the cost. But she knew her vows were fragile against the crushing power of her husband's will. The 7 men moved through their days as though treading across thin ice. Each bore the knowledge of their unchosen bond to the boy. Some avoided even looking at the manor, afraid their eyes would betray too much. Others felt a strange pull, a paternal shadow that gnawed at them. They had been forced into the pact, yet the child was flesh of their blood as much as it was Elinor's. It was a connection they dared not speak aloud but could not deny. Among them, an oath formed in silence. If the day came when the boy's life hung in peril, they would not stand idly by. As the child grew, so too did the rumors outside the estate. Visitors began to notice the subtle dissonance between the colonel's proclamations and the child's appearance. They asked questions too politely worded to seem accusatory, but the colonel heard accusation in every syllable. His responses grew sharper, his laughter louder, his boasting more grotesque. He threw grand feasts to drown out the whispers, filling his halls with music and drink. Yet each night ended in shouting matches behind closed doors, Elinor's sobs echoing through the manor's chambers. The breaking point came one autumn evening when a wealthy neighbor, emboldened by drink, remarked upon the boy's complexion. The words were spoken half in jest, but the colonel's fist slammed upon the table with such force that glasses shattered. Silence followed, suffocating and heavy, until Ashford forced a laugh through gritted teeth. Yet that moment sealed the truth the world had begun to notice. Afterward, his cruelty escalated. He forbade Elinor from visiting the village, from attending church, from speaking freely even within her own home. He doubled punishments upon the enslaved, lashing out with a fury that seemed to dare the world to challenge him. The 7 men bore the brunt of his wrath, whipped for the smallest mistakes, their bodies scarred with reminders of the power he still wielded. But beneath his cruelty lay fear. He could sense his empire crumbling, brick by brick, and each act of violence was his attempt to hold it together. Elinor, in her despair, found herself confiding quietly to the midwife who had attended the birth. She begged her to keep silent, to swear upon her soul that the truth would never pass her lips. The midwife promised, but her eyes betrayed the knowledge that secrets, like wounds, had a way of festering until they burst. Elinor wept into the night, her son clutched to her chest, while outside the wind rattled the shutters like the ghost of fate knocking at her door. The dynasty teetered, its gilded surface cracked and splintered. Within the manor walls, love and fear wrestled in Elinor's heart. In the fields, the 7 men endured under the burden of silence. And at the center of it all, the child, innocent, fragile, yet undeniably marked, became both the heir to Ashford's wealth and the harbinger of its downfall. The pact, born of arrogance and cruelty, had flowered into living proof, and no force of will could undo what had been done. By the time the boy reached his 2nd year, the Ashford estate had become a place of constant tension. Every laugh from a servant, every sidelong glance from a guest, seemed to carry hidden meaning. The colonel walked with the posture of a man under siege, yet his arrogance refused to bend. He demanded that all treat the child as his rightful heir, parading him through drawing rooms and onto verandas, forcing visitors to praise the boy's charm and strength. Yet even as compliments were offered, Elinor could see suspicion glint in their eyes. It was a danger she felt growing, like a storm cloud thickening on the horizon. In the quarters, the 7 men bore their daily labor in silence, yet each carried the weight of the boy's existence in his heart. They watched from afar as Elinor held him in the garden, as the colonel strutted with him across the veranda, and though they said nothing, each recognized something of himself in the child's face. To them, he was more than the colonel's heir. He was a living reminder of survival, of unity forged in degradation. Still, they dared not speak aloud what they felt. To acknowledge it would be to place a noose around their own necks. The colonel's paranoia soon turned outward. He began accusing neighbors of plotting to disgrace him, of whispering slanders behind his back. He sent threats in letters, challenged men to duels, and stalked his own halls like a predator. At night, his voice thundered in Eleanor's chambers, hurling accusations that she had bewitched him, that she had colluded with slaves to ruin him. Eleanor bore these tirades in silence, clutching her child and praying for dawn. She knew her husband's mind was unraveling, and with it the stability of the entire estate. The boy himself grew with a brightness that both warmed and terrified his mother. He laughed easily, clutched at her hair with tiny fingers, and toddled through the halls with an innocence untouched by the shadows surrounding him. Yet each day he grew more. The resemblance to the 7 men became harder to conceal. His complexion, his eyes, his curls, all whispered truths the colonel could not bear to hear. Eleanor dressed him in the finest clothes, hoping wealth and finery might disguise what nature proclaimed. But she knew it was only a matter of time before denial collapsed. The turning point came during a Sunday service. The Ashfords sat in the family pew, the boy restless upon Eleanor's lap. When he toddled away, he reached out to one of the 7 men who had been brought to attend the family as part of the household staff. The congregation watched as the child smiled, babbling in delight, his small hand clutching the man's finger with unmistakable familiarity. Gasps rippled through the church. The colonel's face darkened like a thundercloud. He yanked the boy back, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground audibly. Though no words were spoken, every eye in that church carried the seed of scandal back into the town. That night, rage consumed the colonel. He stormed into the quarters, dragging the 7 men into the yard. His voice roared as he accused them of corrupting his house, of spreading rumors, of defiling his honor. He brandished a whip, his fury trembling in every stroke. But something unexpected happened. The enslaved community gathered, a wall of silent bodies standing behind the 7. Their eyes were steady, unflinching. For the first time the colonel hesitated. The whip trembled in his grip, his pride warring with the reality that he was outnumbered, outstared, outwilled. He lashed once, twice, but the defiance in their silence broke something in him. With a growl, he turned and stormed back toward the manor, his pride bleeding into the night air. Eleanor, hidden behind a curtain, had witnessed it all. She realized then that the lie her husband had built could not endure. The enslaved had found courage in unity, the neighbors had begun to suspect, and even God's house had not concealed the truth. She clutched her child to her breast, whispering to him that she would protect him, even if it meant defying the man who ruled them all. For the first time, defiance sparked in her heart. The 7 men, bruised but unbroken, shared a look of silent understanding. Their fates were tied to this child, whether by blood or by circumstance, and they knew the day was coming when their silence would no longer be enough. The pact had been born in cruelty, but its consequence had become a living soul, and that soul's survival would demand choices none of them could yet imagine. The Ashford estate, once a monument to wealth and power, now stood like a gilded tomb, its foundations cracking. The colonel's laughter rang through the halls like madness, Eleanor's prayers echoed like laments, and the boy's laughter, innocent and pure, carried through the corridors like both a promise and a curse. The dynasty, bound to its lie, crept ever closer to collapse, each step heavier than the last, each breath shadowed by the truth waiting to ignite. The boy was 3 years old when the final cracks in the Ashford dynasty split wide open. The colonel's estate, once renowned for its elegance, had grown gaunt with disrepair. Paint peeled from shutters, fields lay untended, and the grandeur of the house was a mask stretched thin over decay. The neighbors still attended his gatherings, but fewer came each season, each visit driven more by curiosity than loyalty. They whispered in corners, and their laughter had the brittle edge of derision. The Ashford name, once pronounced with respect, now carried the sour aftertaste of suspicion. Inside the manor, the atmosphere had become unbearable. Eleanor lived like a ghost, her beauty faded into shadows of worry. She spoke less, her days consumed with caring for her son, her nights with quiet prayers whispered into the dark. The boy thrived despite the suffocating tension. He grew strong, curious, his voice a melody in rooms that had forgotten joy. Yet even his laughter could not erase the danger that stalked him. The more he grew, the more the undeniable resemblance to the Seven emerged. His face bore features that even the most willful eye could no longer ignore. The colonel saw it too. His denial, stretched and battered, snapped in bursts of fury. He shouted at Eleanor, at servants, at the boy himself. His temper flared into violence, objects hurled across rooms, fists slamming against walls, his boots pounding as he stormed through the house at all hours. He drank until he collapsed, waking to rage again. His paranoia consumed him. He accused the townsfolk of conspiring, the slaves of mocking him, Eleanor of betrayal. His dynasty was crumbling, and he could neither accept nor repair it. It was during one such night of drunken wrath that the colonel made his choice. He staggered into the nursery, his face pale with fury, his eyes bloodshot with whiskey. The boy stirred, blinking sleepily as his father loomed over him. Eleanor rushed in, her heart thundering, and threw herself between them. The colonel's hand reached for the child, fingers trembling, but Eleanor's voice cut the air. "You will not touch him." For the first time her defiance burned bright, a flame she had hidden for too long. The colonel froze, shocked by her courage. Then rage overtook him. He raised his hand as if to strike her, but before the blow could fall, the door creaked open. Standing there were the 7 men. Summoned by Eleanor's cries, or perhaps drawn by instinct, they stepped silently into the nursery. Their presence filled the room, not as servants but as guardians. Their eyes met the colonel's, and in that unspoken exchange, the balance of power shifted. The colonel snarled, demanding they leave, threatening lashes, death, ruin. But his words rang hollow. These men had endured his cruelty for years, had borne the lash and the chain, but now they stood for something greater. They stood for blood, for justice, for the child whose life was their silent covenant. The colonel's hand trembled as he reached for the pistol at his belt, but one of the 7 stepped forward, shaking his head slowly. The air was thick with something heavier than fear, inevitability. Eleanor held her son close, her body trembling, as the moment stretched into eternity. Finally, the colonel lowered the pistol, though not in surrender. His voice cracked with venom as he declared that his dynasty was over, that the name Ashford had been poisoned beyond redemption. He spat curses upon Eleanor, upon the child, upon the 7, his words dripping like acid into the night. Then he staggered from the room, his boots pounding down the corridor until only silence remained. That night marked the true death of the Ashford line. The colonel retreated into his whiskey and his rage, but his authority had shattered. He ceased attending church, ceased hosting gatherings, ceased pretending to be anything other than a broken man. The neighbors, sensing weakness, withdrew entirely. The estate became isolated, a hollow monument to a dynasty destroyed by its own arrogance. For Eleanor, the days that followed were a strange mixture of relief and fear. The colonel's wrath no longer struck as it once had, but his presence remained a threat that loomed at every turn. She leaned on the silent strength of the 7, who now watched over the boy from shadows, never speaking of their bond, but never abandoning it. In their quiet defiance she found courage. She knew the future was uncertain, but she also knew the lie that had bound them all was unraveling beyond repair. The child grew, oblivious to the weight of history pressing upon him. He laughed, he played, he reached for the hands that protected him, not knowing they were bound together by a pact born of cruelty and carried forward by love. He was both heir and curse, both the symbol of ruin and the seed of something new. And so the story of the Ashfords, once gilded and proud, ended not with triumph but with silence, its halls echoing with whispers of betrayal, its fields overrun with weeds, its legacy destroyed by the very pact the colonel had thought would secure his power. The dynasty was gone, but the boy remained, a living reminder that even the most carefully guarded lies cannot survive the truth.